Welcome to I Told My Story channel. I'm Charlotte, and I'm 18 years old. Everything started the day I began working as a delivery girl at that famous pizzeria. It was the hardest time of my life. I had lost my mother, and my father had practically written the book on neglect. The only job I could do, knowing how to ride a motorcycle, was delivery. My boss, with tired yet stern eyes beneath his thick eyebrows, looked me over.
"Charlotte, this job requires speed. Are you sure you can deliver on time?"
he asked. My response was firm and quick. Of course, boss. I'm the fastest. He smiled and nodded.
"Good then. If you do your job well, there's a pizza for you every day on the house. Deal?"
he said. Deal, boss. Thank you, I replied. My story at the pizzeria wasn't just about work. Everyone I met there became a part of a unique adventure. For instance, let me tell you about Mr. Mark. He was the most loyal and peculiar customer, known as Big Head Mark. I gave him that nickname because his head was indeed larger than usual, and his eyes were always wide with curiosity. He ordered pizza almost every 2 days and would sometimes give me a small tip from the change in his pocket. Every time he opened the door, he'd start with the same advice.
"Charlotte, quit this delivery job. Get into software development. There are so many tutorials on YouTube. Watch a few. Start freelancing. This job won't take you anywhere."
I would always respond with a faint smile. Okay, Mr. Mark. But deep down, I didn't really take his words to heart. Another loyal customer was kind Mrs. Margaret. She was warm, motherly figure who always greeted me with a big smile and a small tip. But she never forgot to warn me.
"Dear, don't rush. Be careful, okay?"
she'd say, her eyes filled with concern. Don't worry, Mrs. Margaret. I'm careful, I'd reply, trying to reassure her. But she'd take a deep breath, her expression turning somber.
"There was a relative of mine around your age. He always rode a motorcycle, but one day..."
My expression would turn serious without me realizing it, and I'd feel a shiver run down my spine. "Yes, Mrs. Margaret?" I'd ask, knowing where the story was headed.
"One day he rushed out and never came back,"
she'd say, her voice trembling.
"So you promise me you'll always ride slow, won't you?"
A moment of silence would follow as we both drifted into our thoughts. Finally, I'd nod and say, "Okay, Mrs. Margaret, you're right. I'll be more careful." With a slight smile, she'd go back inside, and I'd get back on my motorcycle, trying to ride a little more cautiously this time. Now let me introduce you to Mr. Harold, the most troublesome customer at the pizzeria. Saying he wrote the book on stinginess wouldn't be an exaggeration. Every time he opened the door, he'd immediately inspect the pizza box.
"Look at this. There are fewer slices of sausage this time. Tell that stingy boss of yours to put more sausage on my pizza next time,"
he'd say, squinting at me.
"And this sauce, it won't be enough. Give me another one, or there's no tip for you."
I'd take a deep breath and muster up my patience every time. "Sorry, Mr. Harold. Here's your extra sauce," I'd say, and he'd shut the door quickly without a single word of thanks. I've told you before about my father's indifference. Unfortunately, my mother fell victim to that as well. My father was the epitome of laziness, never considering work. The household was kept afloat by my mother's earnings from cleaning jobs. She'd go from house to house every day, coming home exhausted in the evenings. Eventually, her body couldn't take it anymore, and she fell ill and passed away. After my mother's death, a home-cooked meal became a distant dream. That's why after my evening shifts, my boss, Mr. Ethan, would hand me a large pizza saying,
"You were fast today. You've earned this."
And I'd always say, "Thank you, Mr. Ethan," sincerely. I'd rush home, open the box, and devour the pizza. It was the one thing that made me forget my exhaustion and loneliness. But soon, I didn't realize it had become a habit. Eating pizza every day turned into an addiction. I was now using my tips to buy an extra pizza every day because one wasn't enough to satisfy my hunger. I was gaining weight slowly, but wasn't too bothered by it. However, things changed when even 2 large pizzas no longer sufficed. My tips couldn't cover a third pizza, and my earnings barely covered rent and the portion I gave to my father. As usual, he'd spend the money gambling online and waste it within 2 days. One day, an unusual idea struck me. If I took a small slice from each pizza I delivered, I might be able to gather an extra slice for myself every day. At that time, it seemed like a reasonable plan. My hunger and addiction had clouded my judgment. I know now it was wrong, but back then, I couldn't see it. Now at every delivery, I pull my motorcycle into a secluded spot, open the box, and take a small slice from each pizza. Delivering an average of 20 orders a day meant 20 free slices for me, including the free pizza for Mr. Ethan and the ones I bought with my tips. I was eating 4 to 5 large pizzas a day. This put a heavy strain on my body. I was gaining weight rapidly, my pants were tight, and I could barely zip up my jacket. I even struggled to balance on my motorcycle at times, needing extra effort to maintain control while riding. One day I was on my way to deliver pizza to Mr. Harold. I pulled over, took a small slice, and hurriedly ate it before heading to his house. He opened the door with his usual sly expression.
"You're late,"
he said, squinting at me. "There was traffic, Mr. Harold," I muttered.
"Oh, really? Lately you've always been blaming traffic, but we don't live in a city known for traffic,"
he said, raising an eyebrow. "You're right," I said, handing over the pizza. Mr. Harold opened the box and inspected it closely.
If this one's missing too, something's definitely up,"
he said. I panicked. "What do you mean, Mr. Harold?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a measuring tape, checking the diameter of the pizza.
"Just as I thought. Pizzas used to be 16 inches. Now they're only about 12.5 inches. That means one slice is missing,"
he said, his voice growing more irate. With a mix of shock and guilt, I stammered, Really? No way, that can't be true," my voice trembling. He shook his head.
"It must be your stingy boss. I'm calling him right now to show him this,"
he said, reaching for his phone. Panicked, I blurted out, "Wait, Mr. Harold, it's not my boss's fault. The missing slice, I ate it." Tears welled up in my eyes and started to fall as I turned and ran from the door. My heart raced and I dreaded the consequences that would follow. I got on my motorcycle and rode off without knowing where I was going. Tears streamed down my face as regret gnawed at me. The guilt was suffocating, and before I knew it, I lost control of the motorcycle. Everything went dark in an instant. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in a hospital room. Turning my head slowly, I saw Mr. Mark, Mrs. Margaret, and Mr. Harold standing there with worried expressions. Mr. Mark spoke up first.
"Oh, Charlotte, I told you so many times to get into software development. You almost died. I'm glad you're okay,"
he said before quietly leaving the room. Mrs. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes full of sorrow.
"Oh, my dear, I always warned you to slow down, didn't I? Remember the story about my relative?"
she asked. I nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Margaret, he died in a motorcycle accident, didn't he?" I said. She nodded solemnly.
"From now on, no more riding motorcycles. Take care, my dear,"
she said and walked out of the room. Now it was just Mr. Harold and me. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. He sighed deeply and spoke in a soft voice.
"Charlotte, you almost lost your life over a slice of pizza. The doctor told me what happened. I felt terrible. I wish I hadn't been so harsh that day. If something had happened to you, I'd never forgive myself."
His words hit me hard. I looked up at him, eyes full of regret. "It wasn't your fault, Mr. Harold. It was all on me," I said, ashamed. He gave a faint smile and nodded.
"From now on, you're done with this delivery job, young lady. You're going to work at my son's company, and I'm signing you up for a gym so you can shed those extra pounds. Deal?"
he said. Tears welled up again, but this time with a different emotion. "Deal," I said, a mix of embarrassment and hope. Life has a way of teaching us lessons through our mistakes. My pizza addiction and the slices I took from the orders ultimately led to a new chapter in my life and the support of Mr. Harold. Now I work in the accounting department at his son's company and have lost 33 pounds in 2 months. As for my father, he was still the same, spending his days glued to the TV. But I spent my weekends fishing with Mr. Harold. who now preferred me to call him Grandpa Harold, which he embraced with joy. And don't forget to subscribe to her channel for more stories. Bye!